My name is Tiffany, and I grew up in a family where perfection was the standard, and anything less was overlooked. I was born in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the first daughter of David and Sarah Mitchell. From the very start, my parents seemed determined to mold me into something extraordinary. They had parenting books stacked everywhere in the house and could often be found discussing new child development theories that they were excited to try on me. At the time, I didn't understand what it all meant. To me, it was just the way things were, normal even. Looking back now, I realize how much of their world was consumed by the idea of me being the perfect child, and how that really wasn't me at all. My mom, Sarah, was particularly obsessed with the idea of early learning. I remember her sitting me down with flashcards when I was barely 3, trying to teach me numbers and letters. I wasn't some child prodigy. I was just a regular little girl trying to play with dolls and enjoy my childhood. But it didn't matter. My parents were convinced that I was a canvas for them to paint a perfect picture of success, intelligence, and achievement. The pressure was always there, but I didn't really know any different. Dad, David, was a bit more laid back, but still supportive of whatever my mom wanted to do. I guess in his eyes, he thought she was just trying to do what was best for me. He'd sometimes question if we were going overboard, but Mom would always have an answer for everything. So I spent my early years under the belief that if I just followed the rules, if I did everything Mom said, then I'd eventually live up to the image she had of me. Then came Jessica. When I was 3 years old, my little sister Jessica was born, and suddenly the entire atmosphere of our home changed. From that point on, it felt as though Jessica became the center of attention. The way my parents treated her was so different, so deliberate, and it felt like everything I had ever done was overshadowed by her presence. Jessica was a gifted child, or at least that's how my parents saw her. Where I had been given regular toys, Jessica had puzzles meant for older children, cognitive enhancement kits, and books filled with advanced topics. Every milestone she achieved was celebrated as though it were a miracle. My parents didn't seem to see the beauty in ordinary development. It was always about achieving something extraordinary. The difference between how they treated Jessica and me became more apparent as the years went on. I was just Tiffany, the ordinary firstborn, while Jessica was their second chance to create their perfect child. When Jessica could walk at a younger age than most kids, when she read at levels far above her peers, it was as if I was forgotten. Looking back, I realize it wasn't Jessica's fault. She didn't ask for this kind of pressure. But it was hard not to feel resentful when every time my parents spoke about her, it was with praise and awe. And when they spoke about me, it was more of an afterthought. I tried to be a good daughter, but no matter what I did, I was always second place. Our grandparents, Eleanor and Peter Mitchell, were the only ones who treated both of us equally. I always felt their love and support in ways I never felt from my parents. They weren't concerned with whether we were going to be some great success stories or not. They just loved us for who we were. I loved spending time at their house, especially when I could get away from the constant comparisons at home. It was one of those Sunday afternoons when I was about 5 that I remember most vividly. Grandma Eleanor was sitting on the couch with Jessica and me, reading us stories. I was on her lap, tucked in beside Jessica, and as she read to us, she said something I'll never forget. Both of my granddaughters are perfect just the way they are. Mom didn't like hearing that. She would look at us with that critical eye, and I could tell she was annoyed. Grandma would sometimes say things like, "Children need love, not pressure," and this would send my mom into a defensive mode where she would argue that modern parenting required more lessons, more structure, more discipline. In her eyes, every child had to be something exceptional to be worth anything. I could see Grandma's frustration when she tried to stand up for me. Mom would just brush it off, claiming she needed to focus on Jessica's future because Jessica had real potential. And there I was, stuck in the middle, feeling like a failed experiment. School came and went, and the pattern continued. I wasn't the top of my class, but I was far from the bottom. I made friends, had some hobbies, and did my homework. It seemed normal. But my parents, they barely acknowledged any of it. All I ever heard was, "Jessica is doing so well. Look at her progress." While I was left to figure things out on my own. But it didn't stop there. Jessica was enrolled at the Wellington Academy, this fancy school for gifted children, while I was at the local public school. The tuition for that place cost more than some people's yearly salary, but my parents justified it because Jessica was exceptional. She was getting all the accolades, all the praise, while I was just left to be ordinary Tiffany. It stung every time they compared us, and it only got worse from there. Every time Jessica got an A on something, she'd ask for something in return, like the new iPad or designer shoes. It didn't take long for her to realize that every little achievement came with a reward. Meanwhile, I was just quietly doing my homework, never rewarded, never acknowledged. As time went on, I found myself retreating into my own world, where I didn't need to live up to anyone's expectations. I could never measure up to Jessica, and my parents had made it clear that they didn't care to even try and understand who I was. So I became invisible. But that's where things started to change. I started to understand that I didn't need their approval. I had my own dreams, my own goals, and maybe, just maybe, I could carve a path for myself that wasn't defined by them. As I got older, the growing distance between my parents and me became more apparent. Jessica, my younger sister, was a star in their eyes. I never understood why they focused so much on her every move, constantly pushing her toward greatness, while I seemed to disappear into the background. It wasn't that I was a bad student. I wasn't perfect, but I worked hard. Still, it never felt enough for them. I was used to being the ordinary child. My report cards were filled with B's and a few A's, and that was fine by me. But in the eyes of my parents, that wasn't good enough. They had such high expectations for Jessica, and while I respected her for doing well, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow failed by not being as gifted or extraordinary as they wanted. It was when Jessica got accepted into Wellington Academy, a prestigious private school for the gifted, that I felt truly invisible. I wasn't surprised that she got in. She always seemed to be one step ahead, a child prodigy in their eyes. The tuition for Wellington Academy was astronomical, but that didn't stop my parents. They threw money at the situation, enrolling Jessica in all the best classes and buying her the most expensive educational tools. I couldn't help but wonder why they hadn't invested in me the same way. "Your sister needs to succeed," my mother would say. "We need to make sure she has every advantage in the world." I remember sitting in the kitchen, trying to understand why the same effort wasn't being put into my future. Despite everything, I tried to push these feelings aside and focused on what I could do for myself. I tried to prove my worth, doing well in school on my own. But the attention always seemed to slip away when Jessica was around. Whenever I did something impressive, whether it was a science project I had poured my heart into or an award I had won, it was overshadowed by Jessica's next achievement. At home, it was the same story. I would be praised for a moment, but then the conversation would quickly turn to Jessica's latest academic feat or her accomplishments at Wellington. It was always about her being ahead, surpassing milestones, while I was just there. By the time I turned 13, things had taken a noticeable turn. One evening, I was sitting in my room, enjoying the little space I had, when Jessica demanded it. She wanted my room, my larger room that I had decorated with my favorite bands and some pictures of friends. I thought she was joking, but no, she wasn't. My parents, without hesitation, agreed to move me out. "Your sister needs more space for her educational tools," my mother explained, as if I were selfish for wanting a room of my own. The next day, while I was at school, they moved my things into a much smaller room. Jessica was already settling in. She was thrilled, and I was heartbroken. For the first time, I truly understood my place in their eyes. I would always be second to Jessica. At first, I cried. It felt like the world was unfair, like I had worked so hard for nothing. But over time, I began to realize that I didn't need to keep fighting for their approval. If they wouldn't see me for who I was, I had to learn to see myself. That was when I began planning for my future on my own. High school came, and the pressure intensified. As graduation approached, I began looking at colleges. I wasn't aiming for the Ivy League like Jessica, but I had my sights set on a few reputable state universities. I knew that with my grades and extracurriculars, I could secure a spot at a solid business program. It was during a family dinner that I tried to share my excitement. I was eager to tell everyone about my college plans, to finally have something to celebrate. But as soon as I began, my mother cut me off. "Tiffany, we've been meaning to talk to you." she said, setting down her fork with a stern look. We can't help you with college tuition. We need to save for Jessica's future. She has a real chance at the Ivy League, and that's a bigger priority. Her words hit me like a cold wind. They were dismissing me once again. But what about me? What about my future? I asked, barely able to speak through the lump in my throat. That's just how it is, she said, with no apology. You can work after high school or maybe take some community college classes. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I just couldn't. Instead, I sat there, the tears welling up in my eyes, as I realized for the first time that my parents had no intention of supporting me. They had already made their choice. They had chosen Jessica, and I would have to carve out my own future. Grandma Eleanor was the one who saved me that night. After hearing about the conversation, she came to me, sitting by my side, rubbing my back like she always had when I was little. I'm going to pay for your college, Tiffany, she said softly. All of it. You deserve it. And in that moment, I knew that I could still succeed, even if my parents wouldn't support me. It was my time to prove to myself that I was capable of doing things on my own. No matter what anyone thought, the next step in my life was mine to take. I was no longer waiting for validation from my parents. I was going to be the one to build my future, and it would be one that I could be proud of. As I entered high school, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I was no longer going to live for their approval. After years of feeling like an invisible child, I realized that the only way forward was to forge my own path. This wasn't easy, not with the constant comparisons to Jessica, who seemed to do everything perfectly in their eyes, but I was determined to find a way to succeed on my own terms. High school wasn't bad for me, all things considered. I wasn't the top of my class, but I wasn't a failure either. My report cards were always filled with B's and the occasional A, and I was okay with that. I had my own friends, my own activities. I worked hard, and I did my best. I was proud of my efforts, even though my parents seemed to care little for them. The focus was always on Jessica, her latest academic achievements, her newest accomplishments. But when graduation day approached, everything changed. It was the moment I had been working toward for years, college. I had spent countless hours researching colleges, writing applications, and dreaming about the next chapter of my life. I wasn't aiming for the Ivy League. That was never an option. I didn't have the connections or the support, but I had my eyes set on a few state universities with strong business programs. I was ready to take that step, to prove to myself that I could make something of my life without depending on my parents. Then came that fateful family dinner, and everything came crashing down. We were all gathered at the table as usual, grandparents included, enjoying the Sunday roast. Jessica, of course, was regaling everyone with her latest academic achievement, bragging about how she'd gotten into some prestigious program. Mom and Dad beamed with pride, their focus entirely on her. My grandparents watched quietly but with clear affection for both of us. It was then that Grandma Eleanor turned to me, a gentle smile on her face, and asked, "Tiffany, where are you planning on applying for college?" I sat up straight, eager to share my plans. "Well, I've been looking at a few state universities with solid business programs," I said, my voice filled with excitement. Before I could continue, Mom cut me off mid-sentence. "We've been meaning to discuss this with you, Tiffany," she said, setting down her fork with a sharp clink. "Your father and I have decided we won't be able to help with your college tuition. We need to save all our resources for Jessica's education. She's got a real shot at the Ivy League, and that's not going to be cheap." I froze. "You can't be serious," I managed to whisper, my heart sinking into my stomach. Grandpa Peter was the first to speak up, his voice shaking with disbelief. "What about Tiffany's future?" Mom sighed, as though explaining something obvious to a child. "Look, we have to be realistic here. Jessica is gifted. She has real potential. Tiffany is ordinary. She can get a job right out of high school or maybe take some community college classes if she saves up." I could barely breathe. "How dare you?" I muttered, feeling the weight of their words crash down on me. Grandma Eleanor's voice shook with anger. "How can you dismiss your own daughter like this?" she demanded. "Oh, please," Dad snapped, his face reddening. "Let's not pretend Tiffany's ever shown any exceptional abilities. Higher education would be wasted on her. We're just being practical." I couldn't take it anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I shoved my chair back and stood up, tears already streaming down my face. "This is bullshit. I said, my voice shaking with emotion. I've worked hard for everything, and you won't even support me. The argument that followed was a blur. My grandparents were furious. Dad defended his decision, claiming it was the only logical choice. But for me, it was the final straw. I couldn't stay in a house where my worth was defined by some arbitrary standard of success that I could never meet. They had chosen Jessica's future over mine, and in that moment, I knew that my path wasn't going to involve them. That night, I went to my room heartbroken and angry, but I also made a decision. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had Grandma and Grandpa, and for the first time, I realized that their love and support were all I needed to succeed. They were the ones who truly believed in me, and that was worth more than anything my parents could offer. Over the next few months, I focused on my studies. I threw myself into preparing for the SATs, applying to colleges, and securing scholarships. I didn't care about the Ivy League or prestigious programs. I just wanted a chance to prove that I was capable of achieving something on my own. When the college acceptance letters came, I was thrilled. I had been accepted to a solid state university with a scholarship for my business program. It wasn't an Ivy League school, but it was everything I needed, and it was mine. My future was finally in my hands, and it felt incredible. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't need to. Instead, I called Grandma and Grandpa, who were overjoyed for me. They had always been there for me, and now they were the ones who would help me start this new chapter of my life. Their pride in me was everything I needed, and I knew that no matter what happened, I would be okay. For the first time in my life, I felt free from the weight of my parents' expectations. College life suited me perfectly. I finally found a place where I didn't have to constantly compete with Jessica's genius. I thrived in the business program. My professors praised my analytical thinking, and I started to see a future where I could make a real impact in the world. I wasn't just Tiffany, the second-rate daughter. I was Tiffany, the student with ambition and drive, and that felt amazing. When I woke up the next morning, I didn't feel much different. Yet everything had changed. My world, my family, had turned upside down. The words from the night before echoed in my mind like a dull thud. My sister's engagement, the one I'd planned to celebrate with my promotion, had stolen my thunder. It wasn't just the event, it was everything. For years I had worked tirelessly for this moment, only to have it hijacked by my own parents and sister. The party had been an emotional minefield. I had expected so much more from my family, a show of support at least, and maybe even some pride. Instead, my mom had interrupted me before I could even speak, announcing Jessica's engagement as though I was merely an afterthought. I felt my pulse race as I struggled to process the blatant disregard for my accomplishments. How could they do this to me after everything I'd been through? I could still feel the sting of my father's hand gripping my wrist. His whispered threats, cold and calculated, haunted me. He had warned me not to make a scene, but what did he expect? What was I supposed to do? Sit there and smile as they turned my celebration into Jessica's self-centered moment? The thought made my stomach churn. I had spent my entire life trying to meet their expectations, and yet it had never been enough. The truth was clear now. They had never cared about my success the way they had cared about hers. My promotion, my hard work, my sacrifice, it was just another footnote in their eyes. As I stood there confronting my parents and Jessica, the anger I felt was almost too much to bear, but I couldn't just sit quietly anymore. I spoke the truth, my voice steady but firm. The party had been for me, for my achievements, and they had stolen it all. It was supposed to be my moment, my time to shine, but instead, they turned it into a platform for Jessica's endless self-promotion. The realization hit me with a force I hadn't expected. Jessica's face had frozen, that smug smile turning into something darker, something defensive. And then, of course, there was Charles, her fiancé, who had come to her side immediately, backing her up with every word. He had no idea what he was walking into. When he walked out, leaving Jessica behind, it was like the weight of everything hit her all at once. She tried to scream at me, accusing me of ruining everything, but her words didn't have the sting they used to. I had grown tired of her antics, tired of playing second fiddle to her privileged existence. I was no longer that little sister who wanted her approval. I was the woman who had earned her place, even if no one else seemed to care. But then, my father's voice cut through the chaos. He stood up, his face turning red with anger. as he declared I was no longer part of the family. His words were like a slap to my face, but in some twisted way, they also freed me. They had already shown me who they were, and now it was my turn to show them who I had become. I had spent so many years trying to please them, trying to meet their impossible standards. But in that moment, I realized that the only person I needed to prove anything to was myself. The weight of his words didn't crush me like I thought it would. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I was no longer bound by their expectations. The night continued to unravel. My grandparents, who had always been my safe haven, rose to defend me. Grandpa, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. His voice rang out like thunder in a quiet room, announcing that they had changed their will. Everything would go to me, the one person in the family with any integrity. I could see the shock on my parents' faces as the realization hit them like a ton of bricks. They had underestimated me for so long, and now they would face the consequences. The evening ended in chaos. Relatives who had been so supportive of Jessica were now silent, too embarrassed to speak. I didn't care anymore. I was done trying to win their approval. As I walked out the door that night, I knew I was walking away from a life I had spent far too long trying to fit into. I wasn't going to play their game anymore. The next few years were a blur of success and self-discovery. I thrived in my career, pushing through the noise of my family's rejection. My grandparents remained my anchors, the only people who had ever truly supported me. They were proud of my achievements, not because I was the perfect daughter, but because I had earned my place. Jessica's life, on the other hand, seemed to spiral downward. She failed out of Princeton, a testament to the pressure and entitlement she had been raised with. My parents couldn't understand what had gone wrong, but I could. They had created a monster, one who couldn't handle failure and didn't know how to work for anything. Eventually, my work at Meridian Financial propelled me to the top. I became the youngest investment director, a position that had once seemed impossible, but was now a reality. When I told my grandparents, they celebrated as if it were their own achievement. They were the ones who had always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. But then, after years of silence, my phone rang. It was Sarah. She was getting married. Of course, she would. She had always been the one to chase the next shiny thing, to latch on to whatever offered her the most glamour and status. She wanted to meet. I agreed, curious to see what had changed. She showed up with her fiancé, Charles, the same man who had been so quick to dismiss me at the party all those years ago. Sarah, with her designer clothes and perfect life, was still trying to prove something to herself. But I had learnt long ago that I didn't need to prove anything to her or anyone else. I had earned my place, and I wasn't going to let her make me feel small anymore. We talked, but it wasn't the reunion I had imagined. Sarah was still the same, entitled, arrogant, and oblivious to everything I had achieved. Her wedding plans were full of expensive details, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just for show. As she talked about the venue and the lavish ceremony, I realized that she had no idea who I had become. To her, I was still the boring, unremarkable sister, but to me, I was everything I had worked hard to be. I didn't need her validation. I didn't need anyone's. I was finally free. The following months passed in a whirlwind of achievements, both personal and professional. I found myself immersed in my work, growing more confident with each promotion, each new project. Meridian Financial had become my home, my passion. I'd carved out a place for myself where I was valued for what I brought to the table, not for who I was related to. But even as I excelled in my career, a part of me couldn't shake the lingering resentment I had toward my parents and Jessica. They had never truly appreciated me. They had taken everything I worked for and turned it into a tool for their own agenda. They'd always been more concerned with Jessica's image of perfection than with supporting my growth or recognizing my worth. Then, out of nowhere, I got an invitation. It was a wedding invitation from Sarah, my sister, the same woman who had once dismissed me so easily. The words printed on the card were thick with irony. She wanted me to come to her wedding, her big day. Her message was both an apology and a demand, though disguised as a heartfelt attempt to reconnect. I wasn't sure what to think. A part of me wanted to just throw the invitation away, to move on without her, but then something inside me changed. I'd spent too many years giving them the benefit of the doubt, hoping that someday they would see me for who I really was. I'd waited, but I realized now that waiting had never gotten me anywhere. I stared at the invitation for a long time, my thoughts racing. It had been years since that night, the night everything changed. I had made it without them, built a life for myself that I was proud of. The woman I had become was nothing like the girl I had been. Back then, I was a daughter looking for love and validation from my parents. Now, I was a professional, a woman who had found her own worth and had no need to chase after approval. Still, there was something about the invitation that made me pause. Was this real? Was Sarah really ready to mend what had been broken? Or was this just another attempt at manipulation? Another opportunity for her to bask in the light she thought she deserved. I called my grandparents and told them what had happened. They were supportive, as always, but even they could sense the caution in my voice. They knew how much pain I had carried, how much I had invested in the idea of family, but they also knew that I had learnt to stand on my own. "You don't need to prove anything to her," Grandma Eleanor said gently, "but you need to decide if you can forgive her." That was the question, wasn't it? Could I forgive her? After everything she had done, everything she had said, everything she had taken from me, could I really open my heart again to someone who had only ever seen me as a rival? In the end, I decided to go. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew I couldn't keep holding on to the past. The years of bitterness had been draining me. It was time to face my sister and see if there was any real change. The day of the wedding arrived, and I found myself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting my dress. It was a simple but elegant outfit. Nothing flashy, just something I felt comfortable in. For the first time in years, I didn't worry about how I looked. I didn't worry about how they would see me. I was done with that. This was for me, not for them. When I walked into the venue, I felt the weight of the past and the tension in the air. Sarah was already there, her smile so bright it could have blinded anyone in the room. She was in her element, soaking in the attention. I felt a flicker of resentment, but it was no longer a burning fire. It was more like a dull ache, something I had learnt to live with. We made small talk, her awkward attempts to connect with me only reinforcing how far apart we had grown. She was still the same, self-centered, seeking approval, chasing after the next shiny thing. But this time, I wasn't the one chasing after her. I sat through the ceremony, my mind drifting as I watched Sarah and Charles exchange vows. I could see the facade, the carefully constructed image of the perfect couple. But underneath it all, I saw the cracks, the same ones I had seen all those years ago when she had picked material wealth over family. By the time the reception began, I was ready to leave. I wasn't angry anymore. I had no desire to be part of their world of pretense. I had my own life now, one that was real and true to who I was. I didn't need them to complete me. I had learnt that the hard way. As I made my way to the door, I saw Sarah glance at me. Her face was a mixture of confusion and frustration. She didn't understand. She never would. And that was okay, because for the first time, I understood that I didn't need her to. I had everything I needed already. Years passed, and I found my path more clearly than ever. My college education was a turning point in my life. While Jessica struggled with her newfound freedom and responsibilities, I flourished. I graduated with honors and landed a prestigious role at Meridian Financial as a junior investment analyst. It was the kind of success that my parents never thought I could achieve. Yet I did it entirely on my own terms. I kept my distance from them, not because I was angry, but because I was learning to be independent. For the first time, I didn't have to constantly fight for my place. My grandparents, who had supported me every step of the way, were now my rocks. Every Sunday, we'd sit down for dinner, and they'd listen to my stories about work, about the future I was building. They were so proud of me, in a way my parents never had been. Jessica, on the other hand, wasn't doing as well as they'd hoped. My parents were beside themselves. Jessica had gotten into Princeton, sure, but she hadn't managed to handle the responsibility. She was failing her classes, skipping them altogether, and partying more than studying. When my grandparents shared the news with me, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vindication. Jessica had been their golden child, the one they thought would succeed no matter what. But it turned out the constant praise and lack of discipline had led her down a path of recklessness. She was eventually kicked out of Princeton after just 1 year. It was a hard pill to swallow for my parents, who still couldn't understand what went wrong. They had thrown all their energy into shaping her into something she wasn't ready to become. The irony was hard to miss. While they pushed her to the limit, I had quietly carved out my own future. And now, I was the one with stability and success. As for me, I have learned that the hardest lessons in life often come from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. My parents had made me feel like I was unworthy for so long, but I had proved them wrong. Not only had I earned a degree and established my career, but I had also learned what truly mattered in life. It wasn't about proving myself to them. It was about proving to myself that I was capable. I received a promotion at Meridian Financial and quickly climbed the ranks. Within a few years, I was promoted to investment director. My hard work had paid off, and I was finally in control of my destiny. The achievement was bittersweet, though, because it came with the realization that my parents would never truly appreciate what I had accomplished. They had already made their choices, and those choices didn't include me. And then came the day that changed everything. My parents reached out to me again. It was a Saturday morning when I ran into them at a local grocery store. I was picking out some organic produce when I heard my mother's voice. "Tiffany, is that really you?" I turned to find my parents standing there. They looked older, more tired than I remembered. "We've missed you so much," my dad said. It was strange to hear those words after all these years. They invited me to dinner that evening, and against my better judgment, I agreed to go. Dinner was awkward. It felt surreal sitting in their house again, the same house where I had been dismissed all those years ago. My parents couldn't stop praising my achievements, trying to show off in front of their friends. It was almost as if they had forgotten the years they spent dismissing me. Jessica was there too, of course. She had just quit another job and was still trying to navigate her way through life. But it wasn't just the praise that bothered me. It was the way they treated Jessica like she was the key to all their happiness. The way they looked at her, clinging to the idea that her future was their redemption. I realized then that no matter what I achieved, I would always be second to Jessica in their eyes. The true turning point came when I was promoted to investment director at Meridian. My parents insisted on throwing a party, but when the night arrived, they hijacked it. The party that I had paid for and planned for was turned into an engagement party for Jessica. My parents had decided to celebrate Jessica's future while completely dismissing mine. The anger I had buried for years bubbled up, and I couldn't hold it back anymore. I stood up and told everyone the truth, that this was my celebration, and they had turned it into something else. My parents tried to stop me, but I didn't care. I needed them to know that I had earned everything I had. Jessica's engagement wasn't more important than my success. That night, everything fell apart. My parents threatened to disown me, but it didn't matter anymore. Grandma and Grandpa had already changed their will, leaving everything to me. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. I had learned that it wasn't about the money or the title. It was about the relationships that mattered, and those were the ones I had cultivated on my own terms. After the chaos of that night, I moved on. I stopped hoping for my parents' approval, and I focused on building my future. The business flourished under my leadership, and I grew stronger each day. I had my own life, my own path, and for the first time, I realized that I didn't need anyone's approval to be successful. I had done it on my own. As the years passed, I saw Jessica's life continue to spiral. She was still living off my parents, still trying to figure out who she was. I heard through the grapevine that she had broken up with her fiancé and that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. As for me, I didn't need to look back anymore. I was too busy creating the life I wanted. The story of my success isn't about the promotion or the inheritance. It's about the people who believed in me when no one else did. My grandparents, my mentors, and, most importantly, myself. I had learned that love isn't about conditions or expectations. It's about respect. And I had finally learned to respect myself